There are exactly 43 ways to lose a paradise, and Governor Matthias Kellyan was about to discover the 44th. In the grim darkness of the far future, the most dangerous worlds aren't those that know they live in hell. They're the ones that still believe in heaven. Agri-world Verdania had forgotten that the galaxy was a charnel house. For 3 centuries, its greatest crisis had been whether the grain harvests exceeded imperial tithes by 8% or 10%. Children played in fields that stretched beyond horizons, their laughter echoing through air that had never tasted the smoke of burning cities. Museums displayed artifacts from the age of strife as curiosities rather than warnings, their curators speaking of ancient wars the way scholars discussed extinct animals, interesting relics from a more primitive time. Governor Kellyan embodied this willful blindness perfectly. At 53, he was ancient by imperial standards, but had never seen a weapon fired in anger. His greatest military decision had been choosing which dress uniform to wear for the annual PDF parade. His office walls displayed certificates of agricultural excellence rather than battle honors, and his greatest fear had been disappointing the administratum's harvest quotas. If you crave more tales from the dark millennium, hit that subscribe button. You'll need the Emperor's protection for the nightmare that's coming, and faith is strongest in those who support the channel when darkness falls. The first sign of ending came at 0347 hours local time, when senior augur adept Helena Vask noticed readings that made her servo skull attendants chitter with mechanical distress. Her augmetic eye clicked as it focused on data streams that violated everything she understood about peaceful space. "Governor," she voxed through the command network, her usually steady voice tight with confusion that would soon become terror. "I'm detecting multiple massive contacts approaching from the outer system. Trajectory suggests deliberate approach toward Verdania." Kellyan arrived at the augur station within minutes, his ceremonial robes rustling against marble floors polished by generations of servants who had never seen blood. The technological cathedral around them hummed with the prayers of tech priests maintaining ancient machines that had never been asked to track incoming death. Through reinforced windows, Verdania's 3 moons hung like pearls against star-scattered velvet, a view that poets had described as the closest thing to Terra's lost beauty that existed in the galaxy. In 18 hours, those same moons would witness the birth of hell. "Show me," Kellyan commanded, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had never given an order that meant life or death. The hololith projection flickered to life, displaying tactical data that transformed the augur chamber from a place of routine monitoring into a tomb where innocents went to die. 17 massive objects, each the size of small moons, hurtled through space on collision courses with his world. Their composition readings were chaotic. Metal, rock, and something organic fused together in combinations that suggested not construction, but cancer. Could they be Imperial reinforcement craft? Kellyan asked, with the desperate hope of someone watching his universe crack along fault lines he'd never known existed. Perhaps the Navy conducting unscheduled exercises? Helena's mechadendrite appendages twitched as she processed data streams that told a story no Imperial citizen wanted to hear. Negative, my lord. These objects predate our construction techniques by millennia. The drive signatures are crude, aggressive, and, she paused, her augmetic eye clicking as it focused on sensor ghosts that made her human flesh crawl. "I'm detecting massive life signs aboard each craft, millions of them. The comfortable world of crop reports and trade negotiations shattered around Kellyan's feet like glass striking stone. 4 billion Imperial citizens suddenly became his responsibility rather than his subjects, and the weight of their lives pressed down on shoulders that had never carried more than administrative burden. "Time to impact?" he asked, surprised that his voice remained steady while his hands trembled. 18 hours, my lord. 18 hours until Paradise learned that the galaxy was exactly as cruel as the ancient texts claimed. The first rock hit Verdania's southern continent at 21:56 hours with the force of a dying star. The impact crater stretched 30 kilometers across, vaporizing the agricultural processing center of New Prosperity and everyone within a 100-kilometer radius. Seismic shockwaves raced across the planet's surface, toppling grain silos and cracking the foundations of cities that had stood for centuries. But the true horror wasn't the destruction. It was what crawled out of the smoking crater. Colonel Viran Thask commanded the 47th Verdanian PDF Regiment from Fort Castellan, a fortress complex that had never fired its weapons in anger. His men were good soldiers by peaceful world standards, disciplined, well-trained in parade formations, and experts at warehouse security. They maintained their laser guns meticulously and could march in perfect formation. What they had never done was face an enemy that lived for nothing but violence. Through his command bunker's reinforced viewports, Thask watched his ordered world die. The second rock impacted near the capital city of Golden Fields, its massive bulk crushing the Museum of Imperial History and the Cathedral of the Golden Throne. Ancient stained glass windows, depicting 10,000 years of human triumph, became glittering shards mixing with pulverized marble and the screams of the faithful. "Contact! Contact!" screamed Sergeant Darius over the Vox network. His voice cracked with terror as he reported from Forward Observation Post 7. "Massive Xenos movement from the crater sites. They're... Emperor, preserve us. They're huge." The Vox casters throughout the command center erupted with overlapping reports. Lieutenant Cassia's voice cut through the chaos. "Unknown Xenos vehicles approaching Grid Sigma 7. They appear to be constructed from scrap metal, and are those engines welded to the sides?" Through his magnoculars, Thask caught his first glimpse of the enemy. Orks poured from the rock craters like a green tide of muscle, tusks, and crude weaponry. They moved with bestial enthusiasm, their guttural war cries carrying across the burning wheat fields. Some rode in ramshackle vehicles that belched black smoke and seemed held together by sheer orcish determination. Others simply ran on foot, massive axes and crude shooters held high as they charged toward the first human settlements. "PDF units, assume defensive positions," Thask commanded, his training taking over even as his mind struggled to process what he was seeing. "Establish fire lanes covering all approaches to civilian population centers. Priority protection for the evacuation routes." The Ork assault hit PDF checkpoint Delta 9 first. Corporal Marcus Helm had been guarding a simple road junction where farmers brought their harvests to market. His position consisted of a reinforced bunker, 3 heavy stubbers, and 8 men who had never seen combat outside of training exercises. The Orks came at them like a living avalanche. Massive green-skinned brutes wielding weapons that seemed too large for any sane creature to carry. Their crude armor was decorated with skulls, scrap metal, and symbols that hurt to look at directly. Some fired wildly as they charged, their weapons spitting bullets in every direction with complete disregard for accuracy or safety. "Open fire! Open fire!" Helm screamed into his Voxcaster as the first wave of Xenos reached the 100-meter mark. The PDF soldiers responded with parade ground precision. Their last volley struck the charging Orks with disciplined accuracy, dropping several of the massive aliens. For a brief moment, hope flickered in human hearts. Their weapons worked. The enemy could be killed. Then the Orks got back up. Massive green fists punched through the bunker's reinforced walls as if they were paper. Crude axes split human torsos from shoulder to hip. The Orks' bestial laughter mixed with human screams as 8 brave men learned that courage alone wasn't enough against creatures that viewed warfare as the galaxy's greatest entertainment. Within 17 minutes of first contact, Checkpoint Delta 9 went silent. Across the planet's surface, identical scenes played out at a dozen locations simultaneously. The 47th Verdanian PDF Regiment, 4,000 strong and equipped with the finest weapons an agri-world could afford, discovered that they were fighting an enemy for whom death was just another form of fun. The PDF's first organized counterattack began at dawn, 3 hours after the initial landings. Colonel Thask deployed his remaining forces in textbook formations. Overlapping fields of fire, protected flanks, clear evacuation routes for wounded. Everything the Tactica Imperialis recommended for engaging a hostile Xenos force. The Orks didn't read the Tactica Imperialis. Captain Elena Voss led Bravo Company and their Chimera transports across the scorched farmlands toward the primary impact site. Her soldiers were Verdania's finest, veterans of riot suppression and border patrol duties, equipped with standard-issue flak armor and hell guns that could punch through most known materials. Through her Vox link, she coordinated with artillery batteries positioned on the high ground, ready to rain down Emperor's judgment on the Xenos filth. "Contacts at 2 kilometers. Reported her lead vehicle's commander. "Multiple Xenos vehicles approaching from the crater zone. They appear to be... I'm not sure what they are, sir." Through her periscope, Voss witnessed something that violated every principle of military engineering. Ork vehicles careened across the battlefield with complete disregard for terrain, physics, or structural integrity. Crude buggies welded together from agricultural equipment and scrap metal bounced over obstacles that should have destroyed them. Massive trucks covered in armor plating and festooned with weapons charged forward while belching toxic smoke from jury-rigged exhausts. "All units, commence firing," Voss commanded. "Target the lead vehicles. Standard anti-armor protocol." The PDF's disciplined volleys struck the Ork convoy with devastating precision. Lascanon beams punched through crude armor plating. Heavy bolter rounds shredded exposed crew members. For a moment, military doctrine worked exactly as intended. Then the damaged Ork vehicles exploded and kept moving. "What in the Emperor's name?" Voss breathed as she watched a buggy missing its entire left side continue its charge, its Ork pilot howling with what sounded like joy rather than pain. Behind it, a truck burning from 3 different fuel fires accelerated, its crew firing wildly in all directions while standing on seats that were literally on fire. The collision between disciplined Imperial tactics and Ork enthusiasm was as brief as it was catastrophic. Ork vehicles smashed into the PDF formation with the subtlety of meteors, crushing chimeras under their improvised ram prows. Green-skinned monstrosities poured from wrecked transports, showing wounds that would have killed normal beings, but only seemed to make them angrier. Private Marcus Hale found himself face to face with his first orc, a scarred brute nearly 3 meters tall, wielding a crude axe that looked like it had been forged from a tractor blade. The creature's tusks were yellow with age. Its small red eyes burned with primitive fury, and its roar shook the ground beneath Hale's feet. Hale did everything right. Perfect firing stance, controlled breathing, center mass target acquisition. His Hellgun's last beam struck the orc directly in the chest, leaving a cauterized hole that would have dropped any human instantly. The orc looked down at the smoking wound, looked back at Hale, and laughed. The axe split Hale from crown to groin in a single devastating swing. Captain Voss realized her tactical situation had progressed from disadvantageous to catastrophic in under 10 minutes. Her company was being butchered by enemies that seemed to treat mortal wounds as minor inconveniences. Over the Vox network, she could hear her sergeants screaming contradictory reports. Ammunition running low, casualties mounting, enemy reinforcements approaching from multiple vectors. "Fall back to secondary positions," she ordered, her voice steady despite the chaos around her. "Fighting withdrawal, cover the wounded." But orcs didn't allow orderly withdrawals. They sensed weakness like predators, scenting blood, and their assault intensified with each step the PDF took backward. What had begun as a tactical redeployment became a rout, then became a slaughter. By noon, the 47th Verdanian PDF Regiment had ceased to exist as an effective fighting force. Of 4,000 soldiers, fewer than 800 remained combat-capable, scattered across a dozen defensive positions that were being overrun one by one. Colonel Thask sat in his command bunker, staring at tactical displays that showed nothing but red icons. Enemy contacts, friendly units destroyed, population centers under assault. The Vox channels carried a constant stream of desperate calls for reinforcement, medical assistance, ammunition resupply, and increasingly, last rites. "Sir," his communications officer said quietly, "we're receiving a priority astropathic transmission from the sector fleet. Admiral Korath's task force is en route, but..." He paused, swallowing hard. "Estimated arrival time is 6 months." 6 months? Verdania had perhaps 6 hours before complete planetary capitulation. Through the bunker's reinforced walls, the sound of orc war cries grew louder. Governor Kellyan's hands trembled as he signed the evacuation orders in his private study, surrounded by portraits of his predecessors who had governed Verdania through 3 centuries of peaceful prosperity. The irony wasn't lost on him. He would be remembered as the man who lost paradise. "My lord," his aide stammered from the doorway, "the orc forces have breached the outer defensive ring. Colonel Thask estimates we have perhaps 4 hours before they reach the capital." 4 hours. Kellyan looked out his window at golden fields, where citizens moved with the orderly panic of people who still believed their government could save them. Children clutched stuffed animals, while parents carried hastily packed belongings toward the evacuation centers. None of them truly understood what was coming. The governor's first desperate gambit had been negotiation. Using long-range Vox casters, he had attempted to establish communication with the orc leadership. After all, these were clearly sentient beings with some form of military organization. Surely they could be reasoned with, offered tribute, or at least convinced to spare civilian populations. The orc response had been immediate and unambiguous. A recording of what sounded like hundreds of voices roaring, "Wag!" followed by weapons fire that destroyed 2 Vox relay stations. His second attempt had been more creative. The planetary archives contained extensive records of successful alien negotiations from other worlds. He authorized the transmission of mathematical principles, star charts, even samples of classical music, anything that might demonstrate human civilization and intelligence. The Orks responded by using the Vox frequencies to broadcast what could only be described as the galaxy's most obscene drinking songs, performed at volumes that damaged receiving equipment. Perhaps, Kellyan had suggested to his Security Council, we could offer them something they want. Resources, technology, even territory. Half the planet in exchange for safe passage for our civilians. Commander Helena Vask, now his senior military advisor with Colonel Thask trapped at the front, had looked at him with the patience of someone explaining basic mathematics to a child. Governor, from all available data, what they want is a good fight. We are the fight. Our resistance is the resource they're harvesting. Now, with Ork warbands less than 50 kilometers from the capital, Kellyan faced the hardest decision of his sheltered life. The astropathic messages were ready for transmission, desperate pleas to every Imperial authority within reach. The Sector Fleet, the Adeptus Astartes, even the Inquisition. Someone, somewhere, had to hear Verdania's dying scream. Priority transmission to Admiral Korath, Battlefleet Obscurus, he dictated to the astropath. Verdania under Xenos assault. PDF forces overwhelmed. 4 billion Imperial citizens require immediate evacuation. Will pay any price for deliverance. The astropath, her eyes milky white from decades of psychic communion, nodded gravely. The message flies, my lord, but the warp storms between here and the fleet staging areas. It may be weeks before any response arrives. Weeks? They had hours. The evacuation centers had become scenes of barely controlled chaos. Families fought for places on transports never designed to carry entire populations. The wealthy had fled first, of course, taking private shuttles to orbital stations. The poor and middle classes pressed against barricades, hoping their loyalty to the Imperium would earn them salvation. Sergeant Major Diana Cross supervised the evacuation at Processing Center 7, where 30,000 civilians waited for transport ships that could carry perhaps 3,000. She had served in the PDF for 18 years, maintaining order during harvest festivals and settling disputes between merchant families. Nothing had prepared her for choosing who would live and who would die. Please, begged Maria Santos, holding her infant daughter while her husband stood protectively nearby. We've served the Imperium faithfully. Our taxes are paid. Our son serves in the Guard on distant worlds. Surely there's space for one small family. Behind her, 10,000 other families made identical pleas. Cross felt the weight of impossible choices crushing her spirit. The transport ships were already overloaded beyond safety margins. Each additional passenger increased the risk of mechanical failure, of failing to reach orbital safety, of everyone dying in the void. Next transport lifts in 6 hours, she said, knowing it was probably a lie. Wait in Block 7. Stay together. The distant rumble of explosions grew closer as Ork artillery, crude but devastatingly effective, found its range on the capital's outer districts. The Museum of Natural History disappeared in a pillar of flame and smoke. The Imperial Shrine, where 10 generations of Verdanians had married and buried their dead, became a crater filled with marble dust and shattered faith. Governor Kellyan made his final transmission as enemy shells began falling on the Administratum district. "This is Governor Matthias Kellyan of Verdania, loyal servant of the God Emperor. We have fought with honor against impossible odds. Our citizens have shown courage in the face of extinction. If any Imperial forces receive this message, know that Verdania died true to the throne. The Emperor protects, even in our darkest hour." The Voxcaster went silent as power failed throughout the governmental complex. Through his shattered window, Kellyan could see Ork aircraft, ramshackle fighters held together with cables and prayer, strafing evacuation convoys with wild abandon. Smoke rose from dozens of fires across his once beautiful city. 4 billion lives. All of them his responsibility. All of them beyond his power to save. The Orks reached the Museum of Imperial Culture at 14:23 hours, and Professor Elena Marquez heard them coming long before she saw them. The sound began as a distant rumble. Engines, explosions, and something else. Voices. Thousands of voices raised in what could only be described as jubilant destruction. She had refused evacuation, choosing instead to remain with the collections that represented 5,000 years of human achievement on Verdania. Ancient manuscripts from Old Terra, paintings that captured the planet's transformation from wilderness to paradise, sculptures carved by masters whose names were whispered with reverence across a dozen sectors. "Professor, we need to go." Curator Marcus Vale burst into her office, his usually immaculate robes torn and stained with smoke. "The Xenos have broken through the cultural district perimeter. They're burning everything." Through the reinforced windows of the museum's highest tower, Marquez watched her civilization die. The Great Library, repository of 10 million volumes including original copies of the Imperial Truth, blazed like a funeral pyre. Orks danced around the flames, hurling books into the fire, while their crude weapons discharged into the smoke-darkened sky. But it wasn't mindless destruction. That would have been almost bearable. Instead, the Orks displayed a disturbing creativity in their vandalism. Ancient statues weren't simply smashed. They were rearranged into obscene parodies of their original form. Priceless paintings were used as targets for weapon testing, the Orks apparently delighting in seeing how many holes they could punch through canvas that had survived millennia. The museum's first line of defense had been its security servitors, ancient machines programmed to protect the collections from theft or vandalism. They lasted exactly 37 seconds against the Ork assault. Not because their weapons were ineffective, but because the Orks found the servitors amusing and decided to improve them with scrap metal additions and crude Orkish modifications. Marquez watched in horror as her modified security servitors began attacking the very exhibits they were designed to protect, now sporting extra arms welded from pipe fittings and vocal units that screamed Orkish battle cries. "The basement archives," she whispered, her mind racing through desperate calculations. "If we conceal the sublevels, perhaps some of the oldest manuscripts can survive until Imperial forces arrive." Vale stared at her, as if she'd suggested they could fly to safety by flapping their arms. "Professor, there are no Imperial forces coming. The PDF is gone. The governor is dead or fled. We're on our own." The first Orks reached the museum's main entrance with the subtlety of a tectonic shift. The ornate doors, crafted from Verdanian oak and inscribed with verses from the Imperial Creed, exploded inward under the impact of crude but effective breaching charges. What followed was a masterclass in the complete incompatibility between human civilization and Orkish culture. The hall of planetary history, where school children had learned about their world's transformation from agricultural colony to cultural center, became an impromptu fighting pit. Orks rearranged the display cases into crude barricades, then used the priceless artifacts as ammunition for their weapons. A ceramite tablet bearing the original colonial charter, signed by the planetary governor in M39, became a projectile that shattered the museum's central skylight. The Gallery of Fine Arts suffered perhaps the worst fate. The Orks discovered that the ancient paintings, when set on fire, created different colored flames depending on their pigments. Soon they were systematically burning through centuries of artistic achievement, hooting with delight at each new shade of destruction they created. But the true horror came when they reached the Hall of Remembrance, where the names of every Verdanian who had died in service to the Imperium were inscribed on walls of polished marble. The Orks couldn't read Gothic script, but they understood the reverent nature of the memorial. So they defaced it, not with random scrawls, but with their own crude pictographs depicting Orkish victories. They were literally overwriting human history with their own barbaric narrative. Professor Marquez made her last stand in the archive of ancient texts, surrounded by manuscripts that predated the Great Crusade. As Ork boots thundered through the corridors above, she worked frantically to download critical files onto data crystals, hoping that somehow, some way, fragments of Verdania's cultural legacy might survive the coming darkness. The first Ork to reach the archive was a massive specimen wearing what appeared to be a curator's robe as a trophy. It looked at Marquez, looked at the ancient books, and spoke in heavily accented Low Gothic. "You's got more books. We needs more fire." The creature grabbed an illuminated manuscript worth more than most planets' annual tithes and began tearing out pages to use as kindling. Marquez drew the last pistol she'd never expected to fire and put 3 shots center mass into the Ork's chest. The creature looked down at the smoking holes, looked back at her, and began to laugh. "You's got spirit. Boss is gonna like you." The manuscript in its hands, a first edition copy of the Lectitio Divinitatus, burst into flames. The transformation began within hours of the initial invasion, but its full horror wouldn't be understood for weeks. Deep beneath Verdania's fertile soil, microscopic organisms stirred to life. Ork spores that had been dormant within the rocks, waiting for the right conditions to begin their insidious work. Dr. Sarah Vex, the planet's chief xenobiologist, first noticed the anomalies from her laboratory bunker 3 kilometers beneath the University of Agricultural Sciences. Her equipment registered massive shifts in the planetary ecosystem, soil composition changing at the molecular level, plant life mutating in ways that defied conventional biology, and something else. Something that made her augmetic sensors scream warnings about contamination levels. "Impossible," she whispered, staring at data streams that violated everything she knew about xenobiology. The cellular structures are rewriting themselves. It's as if the entire biosphere is being infected. Her servo skull, designation Theta 7, hovered nearby with mechanical clicks of distress. Its picked recorders had captured images from the surface that bordered on heretical, wheat fields transforming into crude fungal growths, fruit trees bearing objects that looked suspiciously like primitive weapons, and worst of all, the appearance of entirely new organisms that seemed purpose-built for warfare. On the surface, the Orks had begun their most ambitious project yet. Big Mech Scarjaw surveyed the ruins of golden fields through telescopic vision enhanced by crude cybernetic implants. Where once stood the planetary capital's gleaming spires, he envisioned something far more practical, a proper Ork settlement. "Boys," he bellowed to the mob of mechs and Gretchen following him through the rubble. "We's gonna build the biggest, loudest, most shooty fortress this world ever seen. Start tearing down them Humy buildings. We needs the metal." What followed was less construction than directed chaos. Ork engineering operated on principles that would have driven Imperial tech priests to madness. Structural integrity was optional. Safety protocols were for weaklings. If something looked like it might work, it probably would, through sheer Orkish determination and the universe's apparent willingness to bend physics around their expectations. The Cathedral of the Golden Throne, Verdania's most sacred structure, became the foundation for Scarjaw's fortress. Its marble walls were reinforced with scrap metal torn from destroyed vehicles. Its soaring spires were converted into weapon platforms for crude but devastating artillery pieces. Most blasphemously, its altar was repurposed as an ammunition depot where Gretchen packed shells with explosive compounds that shouldn't have been stable but somehow were. Captain Diana Cross, one of the few PDF officers still alive and free, watched this desecration from a concealed observation post in the ruins of the Ministry of Agricultural Production. Her small band of survivors, 17 soldiers and 43 civilians, had managed to evade capture for 6 days, moving through maintenance tunnels and abandoned buildings while the Orks consolidated their hold on the planet. "They're not just occupying our world," she reported through a heavily encrypted Vox transmission to whatever Imperial authorities might be listening. "They're transforming it. The spores they've released are changing everything at the genetic level. Even if we could somehow drive them off tomorrow, Verdania would never be the same." The ecological transformation accelerated with each passing hour. Ork spores didn't simply grow into new orks. They created entire ecosystems designed to support warfare. Fungal growths that produced ammunition, plant-like organisms that generated fuel for vehicles. Even more disturbing, primitive creatures that seemed to exist solely to maintain Ork equipment through methods that bordered on the supernatural. In the vast agricultural processing centers that once fed a dozen worlds, Ork mechs established crude factories. Where precision machinery had once sorted grain with mechanical perfection, ramshackle production lines now churned out weapons, vehicles, and war materiel with Orkish efficiency. The quality was terrible by Imperial standards, but the quantity was staggering. "They don't build them like we do," laughed mech boy Scarjaw as his latest creation, a tank constructed primarily from agricultural equipment and scrap metal, rolled out of the factory belching black smoke. "But we builds more of them." The most horrifying aspect of the Ork occupation wasn't their violence or their destruction, it was their efficiency. Despite appearances, they were systematically converting Verdania into a fortress world capable of supporting massive military operations. What looked like random chaos was actually purposeful preparation for the next phase of their expansion. Still with us in the darkness? Hit that like button if this tale of transformation chills your soul. The worst is yet to come. Underground, Dr. Vex's readings grew more alarming by the hour. The spore contamination had reached critical mass, creating a self-sustaining ecosystem that would continue producing orcs for decades to come. Even if every greenskin currently on the planet were somehow eliminated, the spores would eventually generate new populations. "We're not just witnessing an invasion," she recorded in what she knew might be her final log entry. "We're witnessing the birth of a permanent orc presence in Imperial space. This world is lost not just to this generation, but to all generations that follow." Above ground, the sound of construction continued through the night. Hammering, welding, and the constant roar of engines as the orcs built their vision of paradise, a world dedicated entirely to warfare. Where once grain had grown to feed the Imperium's faithful, now weapons factories prepared for the next Wah. Captain Diana Cross crouched in the ruins of the Agricultural Ministry's sub-basement, her remaining forces gathered in a circle of grime-stained faces illuminated by a single flickering lumen globe. 17 PDF troopers and 43 civilians, all that remained of Golden Fields' population of 12 million. "We can't win," whispered Private Hale, his voice hoarse from 6 days of breathing smoke and dust. "There's too many of them." "They're everywhere." Cross studied her makeshift command staff. Sergeant Torres, who'd lost his left arm to an orc cleaver but still carried his laser gun with grim determination. Corporal Ming, a former warehouse supervisor whose knowledge of the city's underground systems had kept them alive this long, and Professor Marquez, clutching a data crystal containing fragments of their civilization's memory. "We don't need to win," Cross said quietly, her words carrying the authority of someone who'd already accepted death. "We just need to make them pay for every meter of our world." Their guerrilla campaign had begun with fury and desperation. Using maintenance tunnels that honeycombed beneath the capital, they struck at isolated orc patrols and supply convoys. Cross's soldiers knew every hidden passage, every forgotten bunker, every weakness in the infrastructure they had once protected. The orcs, despite their brutish appearance, proved frustratingly adaptable opponents. After losing 3 supply columns to tunnel ambushes, they simply began filling the tunnels with explosive charges, sealing entire sections of the underground network. When the humans struck from rooftops, the orcs demolished buildings indiscriminately until the cityscape became an impassable maze of rubble. But the resistance fighters learned too. Corporal Ming discovered that orc vehicles, for all their crude durability, shared a critical vulnerability. Their fuel systems were so haphazardly constructed that a single well-placed shot could turn any transport into a rolling bomb. Professor Marquez's knowledge of the city's layout revealed dozens of choke points where small teams could inflict disproportionate casualties. Their greatest success came during the 3rd week of occupation. Intelligence gathered from captured Gretchen revealed that the orcs were storing ammunition in the former cathedral of the Golden Throne. Cross's team infiltrated through the old pilgrimage tunnels, planted improvised explosives throughout the sacred building, and withdrew to watch 4,000 years of faith disappear in a pillar of fire that rose 3 kilometers into the sky. The explosion killed roughly 200 orcs and destroyed enough ammunition to supply a regiment for months. More importantly, it proved that the invaders weren't invincible. The orc response was swift and characteristically brutal. Boss Scarjaw declared a grot hunt, a contest to see which mob could capture the most humans alive. The prize was extra rations and first choice of the best scrap metal for weapons. Within hours, Every Ork warband on the planet was actively hunting the remaining survivors. "Day's sneaky little grots," Scarjaw announced from his throne made of welded tank treads and decorated with human skulls. "But we's sneakier. Find 'em all, boys. Find 'em and bring 'em back for the fights." The Ork search parties moved through the ruins with surprising methodical precision. They used captured PDF equipment to scan for human life signs, employed Gretchen scouts who could fit into spaces too small for their larger masters, and most disturbingly, seemed to possess an intuitive understanding of human psychology that let them predict where survivors might hide. Maria Santos and her family lasted 13 days in the basement of their apartment building, surviving on stored food and rainwater collected through improvised gutters. They might have lasted longer, but their infant daughter's cries drew the attention of a passing Ork patrol. The family's desperate attempt to silence their child came too late. The Orks dragged them into the street with casual brutality, but what followed wasn't immediate execution. Instead, they were processed through a crude sorting system that separated civilians into different categories: potential slaves, breeding stock, and entertainment. The lucky ones were killed quickly. Cross received word of the Santos family's capture through the Resistance's dwindling communication network. Another dozen families had been taken in the past day alone. The net was tightening around every remaining human on the planet. "We need to change tactics," she announced during their evening briefing in an abandoned water treatment facility. "Direct action isn't working anymore. They're learning our patterns, adapting faster than we can adjust." "What other choice do we have?" asked Sergeant Torres, his phantom limb still reaching for weapons that weren't there. "We can't abandon our people to these monsters." Cross looked around at faces that had aged decades in just weeks. These were good people, farmers, teachers, clerks, and soldiers who'd never expected to fight a hopeless war against alien invaders. But they were still fighting, still refusing to surrender despite impossible odds. "We don't abandon anyone," she said with quiet conviction. "But we stop trying to win battles and start thinking about the war. There will be other Imperial forces coming eventually. Our job is to make sure they have something to fight for when they arrive." Outside, the sounds of Ork celebration carried across the ruins as another human stronghold fell to their relentless advance. Big Mech Scarjaw stood atop the twisted wreckage of what had once been Verdania's primary orbital defense platform, now serving as the foundation for his greatest creation. Around him, hundreds of mechs and Gretchens scurried like ants across a construction site that defied every principle of engineering known to civilized species. "Boss," wheezed his lead assistant, a scarred Ork called Wrenchgut, "the big shooter's ready for testing. But, we's not sure which end the shells come out of." Scarjaw's mechanical eye whirred as it focused on the massive artillery piece rising from the cathedral's ruins. Built from melted-down cathedral bells, reinforced with armor plating torn from destroyed chimeras, and powered by a fusion reactor that had once supplied energy to half the capital, the weapon represented the pinnacle of Ork engineering philosophy. If it looked dangerous and made loud noises, it was probably ready for battle. "Don't matter which end," Scarjaw roared with delight. "Dangerous both ways means it's twice as good." The transformation of Verdania's infrastructure had accelerated beyond what even Imperial strategists would have thought possible. Every major city now hosted at least one massive construction project. Ork mechs had converted the University of Agricultural Sciences into a research facility where they attempted to breed bigger, angrier versions of local wildlife. The planetary communications array had become a massive vox amplifier capable of broadcasting Ork war songs across multiple star systems. But Scarjaw's masterpiece was the Great Rock Launcher, a weapons system designed to catapult ship-sized projectiles across interstellar distances. The concept was simple. Take Verdania's orbital elevator, reinforce it with every scrap of metal on the planet, and use it as the galaxy's largest slingshot. "When we's done," Scarjaw explained to his assembled mechs, gesturing wildly at architectural plans that looked like they'd been drawn in crayon by enthusiastic children, "we can shoot whole ships at the enemy. They won't know what hit 'em until it already did." The engineering challenges were staggering. The original orbital elevator had been a masterpiece of human technology, using advanced materials and precisely calculated structural dynamics to transport cargo between planetary surface and orbital stations. Converting it into a weapons platform required modifications that would have driven Imperial tech priests to madness. First, they doubled its mass by welding on armor plating torn from every vehicle on the planet. Then they tripled its power requirements by installing engines borrowed from crashed starships. Finally, they added weapon systems at random intervals along its length, creating a structure that was part space elevator, part fortress, and part abstract art project. "Will it work?" asked Wrenchgut, staring up at the towering construction that disappeared into Verdania's cloud layer. "Course it'll work," Scarjaw declared. "'Cause if it don't, we'll hit it with hammers till it does." The project consumed resources at an alarming rate. Ork salvage teams stripped metal from buildings, vehicles, and infrastructure across the entire planet. The beautiful spires of golden fields were torn down and melted into structural supports. The carefully maintained highways became quarries for concrete and rebar. But the most disturbing aspect of Ork engineering wasn't its crude appearance. It was its effectiveness. Despite violating every known law of physics and structural engineering, their constructions worked. The massive artillery pieces fired. The improvised factories produced ammunition. The converted vehicles continued operating despite modifications that should have rendered them inoperable. Dr. Sarah Vex, still hiding in her underground laboratory, monitored the construction through seismic sensors and found herself confronting data that challenged her understanding of reality itself. The Ork structures shouldn't be stable. Their power requirements exceeded what their jury-rigged systems could possibly provide. Their weapons platforms generated more force than their foundations could support. Yet they worked anyway. It's as if the universe itself is conspiring to make their nonsensical designs functional, she recorded in her increasingly desperate log entries. Their belief that something should work appears to be making it work. This isn't engineering, it's mass psychic manipulation of physical laws. The implications were staggering. If Ork technology operated on principles of collective belief rather than scientific understanding, then conventional Imperial responses would be inadequate. You couldn't defeat an enemy whose weapons worked because they expected them to work. Meanwhile, Scarjaw's construction crews made final preparations for the Great Rock Launcher's first test firing. The projectile was a masterpiece of Ork craftsmanship. A hollow asteroid filled with vehicles, weapons, and several hundred volunteers eager to crash into the next world and begin the cycle anew. "Ready to big shooter," Scarjaw commanded from his control platform, surrounded by instruments that appeared to have been assembled from kitchen appliances and starship navigation systems. "We's gonna show them humies how real orcs make war." The targeting system consisted of a telescope pointed in what the mechs considered a good direction, toward a star system that Imperial astrocartography identified as Helix Prime, an agricultural world similar to Verdania before its fall. As power built in the massive launch mechanism, seismic tremors shook the planet's crust. Emergency klaxons wailed from automated systems still functioning in abandoned bunkers. Even the orcs seemed momentarily awed by the magnitude of what they had created. "Boss," whispered Wrenchgut, "what if we miss?" Scarjaw's laugh echoed across the construction site. "Then we build another one and try again." That's what makes it fun. The evacuation sirens had been wailing for 18 hours straight when Captain Marcus Thane of the Imperial Navy frigate Righteous Dawn received the astropathic distress calls from 3 different star systems. Each message carried the same desperate plea. Massive orc rocks had appeared in a system, heading for populated worlds with no defensive capabilities. "Sir," reported his communications officer, Lieutenant Vega, her face pale as she processed the flood of emergency transmissions. "The messages are coming from Helix Prime, Sanctuary's Rest, and Agrippa 7. All agricultural worlds, sir. All reporting imminent orc invasion." Thane studied the tactical displays in his ship's command center, watching red icons multiply across the holographic star chart. The pattern was unmistakable. A coordinated "Wah" was spreading across the sector like a plague, consuming one peaceful world after another. "Time since the first distress call from Verdania?" he asked. 43 days, sir. 43 days from invasion to launching new attacks. The orcs weren't just conquering worlds, they were converting them into forward bases for further expansion at a rate that defied every strategic projection in the Imperial tactical databases. The Righteous Dawn was part of Admiral Korath's relief fleet, originally dispatched to Verdania in response to Governor Kellyan's final transmissions. But by the time the fleet had navigated the warp storms and emerged into real space, the situation had deteriorated beyond salvation. Through the viewport of his command bridge, Thane could see Verdania hanging like a diseased jewel against the star field. Where once a blue-green agricultural paradise had shone with the light of human civilization, now a sickly green glow emanated from massive industrial complexes that pulsed like infected wounds across the planet's surface. "Augur readings, Lieutenant Karras," Thane commanded. The sensor officer's mechanical augmetics clicked nervously as he processed the data streams. "Sir, I am detecting massive energy signatures from the planetary surface. Multiple construction projects on a scale that, so that rivals Imperial fortress worlds. And the orbital traffic." He paused, his organic eye widening in disbelief. "They're launching projectiles, sir. Ship-sized projectiles. Into deep space." Admiral Korath's voice crackled through the fleet communication system. "All vessels, maintain formation at maximum engagement range. We're not here to retake Verdania. That world is lost. Our mission is intelligence gathering and damage assessment. I want to know how they're spreading so quickly." The answer became apparent within hours of observation. The Ork Great Rock Launcher was operational, hurling massive projectiles toward distant star systems with devastating regularity. Each rock contained hundreds of orcs, vehicles, and enough supplies to establish a beachhead on any world they struck. But the most disturbing revelation came from the fleet's astropaths. The psychic emanations from Verdania had changed, twisted into something that made sensitive psychers scream in their restraint chambers. The planet's population, 4 billion Imperial citizens, hadn't simply been killed. They had been absorbed into the Ork war machine, their life energy feeding the growing Wah. "Sir," reported the fleet's chief astropath, her voice hollow with psychic exhaustion, "the planet is singing." All those voices, all those souls, they're part of something larger now. The Orks aren't just using this world as a base. They're using it as an amplifier for their collective psychic field. The implications staggered even veteran Imperial officers. If Orks could harness the psychic potential of conquered populations, then every world they took made them exponentially more powerful. Each victory didn't just provide resources. It provided psychic energy that made their impossible technology even more effective. Back on Verdania's surface, the evacuation that had never come haunted the planet's few remaining human survivors. Processing Center 7, where Sergeant Major Diana Cross had once maintained order among desperate civilians, had become something far worse than a tomb. The Orks had discovered that humans made excellent entertainment when properly motivated. The evacuation centers had been converted into gladiatorial arenas where captured survivors fought each other for the amusement of their captors. The promise was always the same. Victory meant freedom. The reality was that freedom meant being fed to the next group of fighters. Maria Santos stood in the center of Arena 12, clutching a crude spear made from sharpened rebar, facing another mother who held a similar weapon with shaking hands. Around them, hundreds of Orks cheered and placed bets on the outcome, their bestial laughter mixing with human screams to create a symphony of despair. "Fight good, Humies!" roared Boss Scarjaw from his elevated throne. "Winner gets extra food. Loser gets eaten. Everybody wins." The arena floor was stained with the blood of thousands who had fought and died for Ork entertainment. Children who had once played in Golden Fields' parks now served as attendants, maintaining weapons and cleaning gore between matches. The elderly were used as target practice, their final screams adding to the psychic chorus that empowered the Ork war machine. From orbit, Admiral Korath watched the planet through high-powered scopes and felt something die in his soul. He had seen worlds burned by virus bombs, consumed by tyrannid swarms, corrupted by chaos incursions. But this was different. This was systematic cultural extinction, the complete erasure of everything that had made those 4 billion people human. "Admiral," his aide whispered, "the ecclesiarchy representatives are requesting permission to conduct rites of final cleansing for the lost souls." Korath nodded grimly. "Granted. May the Emperor have mercy on their souls, since we cannot." But even as Imperial priests prepared to commend the dead to the Emperor's grace, new rocks launched from Verdania's surface. Each one carried the seeds of further expansion, spreading the green tide to worlds that didn't yet know their paradise was ending. The Ork War had found its rhythm, and the galaxy would bleed green until someone found a way to break the cycle. Admiral Korath stood in the strategium of his flagship Emperor's Wrath, staring at tactical displays that told a story of systematic Imperial failure. 3 months after Verdania's fall, 17 agricultural worlds had gone silent. Each followed the same pattern. Overwhelming Ork assault, desperate resistance, final silence, then the launch of new rocks toward distant systems. "Sir," reported Captain Voss, his fleet intelligence officer, "we've received confirmation from the astropathic relay station at Cygnus Point. Helix Prime has fallen. Total communications blackout as of 0400 hours. The Admiral's cybernetic eye clicked as it processed data streams from across the sector. Helix Prime had been home to 6 billion souls, protected by a full PDF regiment and orbital defense platforms. It had lasted 12 days against the Ork assault launched from Verdania. "How long until they begin launching attacks from Helix Prime?" Korath asked, though he already knew the answer. "Based on previous patterns, sir. 40 to 50 days maximum. 50 days to transform a civilized world into a launch platform for further conquest." The mathematics were horrifying. If each conquered world could launch attacks on multiple targets, the Ork expansion would grow exponentially. 1 world became 3. 3 became 9. 9 became 27. Within a year, half the sector could be under Ork control. The first Imperial Guard relief force had arrived at Sanctuary's Rest while the planet was still fighting. Colonel Brennan's 23rd Cadian Shock Regiment, veterans of a dozen major campaigns, had deployed with full mechanized support, orbital fire assistance, and complete confidence in their ability to crush any Xenos incursion. They lasted 6 weeks. "The final transmission from Colonel Brennan," Captain Voss continued, reading from data slates with the precision of someone delivering funeral rites, "indicated that the Orks were using captured Imperial equipment against our forces. Not just vehicles and weapons, sir, but tactical doctrines. They appear to have learned from observing our deployment patterns." Korath felt a chill that had nothing to do with the ship's environmental systems. Orks learning Imperial tactics was bad enough, but Orks who could adapt and improve upon those tactics represented a threat that existing military doctrine was unprepared to handle. The worst confirmation came from the few survivors evacuated from Agrippa 7. Sergeant Major Elena Cross, no relation to the Diana Cross who had died fighting on Verdania, brought with her reports that defied belief but were supported by picked capture evidence. "They're not just killing our people," Cross reported to Korath during her debriefing aboard the Emperor's Wrath. "They're studying them. I watched Ork mechs dissecting captured PDF officers, not for torture, but for research. They wanted to understand how human military organization functioned." The interview recordings made for grim viewing. Cross, her face hollow with exhaustion and trauma, described Ork installations where captured Imperial personnel were forced to demonstrate military procedures while their captors took notes. Logistics officers explaining supply chain management to fascinated Ork quartermasters. Communication specialists teaching VoxNet protocols to Gretchen operators. The Orks on Agrippa weren't like the reports from earlier campaigns, Cross continued. They used combined arms tactics, coordinated artillery support, even what appeared to be strategic deception operations. "Sir, they're learning faster than we can adapt our responses." Admiral Korath dismissed Cross with appropriate honors and commendations, then sealed himself in his private quarters to contemplate the implications. The Imperial Navy had contingency plans for many types of Ork incursions. Massive wars, led by charismatic war bosses, could be countered through decapitation strikes. Random raiding could be contained through patrol actions and defensive fortifications. But a learning, adapting, systematically expansionist orc force represented something entirely new. His astropath, an ancient woman whose psychic abilities had been honed through decades of service, brought even worse news during the evening tactical briefing. Admiral, the warp currents in this region are changing. The psychic emanations from the orc-controlled worlds are creating interference patterns that make long-range communication increasingly difficult. Meaning that as their territory expands, our ability to coordinate responses diminishes. Each world they take makes them stronger while making us more isolated. It's as if they're creating a psychic dead zone around their conquered territory. Koreth stared out through the armored viewports at stars that might already be lighting orc-controlled worlds. Somewhere out there, human colonies were receiving their first warnings of approaching rocks. PDF commanders were reading reports of orc expansion and wondering if their preparations would be adequate. Governors were drafting evacuation orders that would never be carried out. The tactical displays showed Imperial response forces converging on suspected orc targets, but they were always one step behind. By the time fleets arrived to relieve besieged worlds, those worlds had already fallen and begun launching new attacks. The Imperial military machine, designed for methodical campaigns against predictable enemies, was failing against an opponent that operated at a tempo beyond human comprehension. "Signal the sector fleet," Korath commanded. "Priority Alpha transmission to Terra. We need Astartes support, Titan Legion deployment, and authorization for extreme measures. This isn't just a Xenos incursion anymore. It's a cascade collapse event that could destabilize the entire sector." But even as his communications officers prepared the urgent messages, Koreth knew that help was months away at best. The warp storms that had delayed their initial response to Verdania continued to rage, making reliable astropathic communication a matter of chance rather than certainty. Meanwhile, on 17 different worlds, orc mechs worked around the clock to construct new launch platforms. Each conquered population added their psychic energy to the growing "Wah!" Each captured piece of Imperial technology was reverse-engineered and improved upon with typical orc enthusiasm. The green tide was rising, and the Imperium was running out of time to build seawalls. The debate in the Sector Command's war room had raged for 18 hours, and Admiral Koreth could see exhaustion etched on every face around the hololith table. The tactical display showed the orc expansion like a cancer spreading across the sector. 23 worlds silent, 12 more under active assault, and the green tide showing no signs of slowing. "The mathematics are clear," stated Inquisitor Valerius, her servo skull hovering beside her as it projected casualty estimates into the holographic display. "At current expansion rates, we will lose 70% of this sector's agricultural capacity within 6 months. The resulting famine will kill more Imperial citizens than the orc invasions themselves." General Mordax of the Astra Militarum slammed his augmetic fist on the table, causing the hololith to flicker. "Then we stop debating and start acting. Deploy every available guard regiment, mobilize the sector fleet, fight them on every world until they're ground down to nothing." With what forces? Admiral Korath's voice carried the weariness of a man who had already run these calculations 100 times. The 23rd Cadian Shock Regiment was annihilated on Sanctuary's Rest. The Mordian Iron Guard couldn't hold Agrippa VII for 2 weeks. Every engagement teaches them more about our tactics while costing us irreplaceable veterans. Captain Thane, recently promoted after his reconnaissance mission to Verdania, brought up the sensor logs that haunted every Imperial strategist in the room. Sirs, the intelligence gathered from our observational missions confirms the worst-case scenario. The Orks aren't just conquering worlds, they're optimizing them. Each installation they build is more sophisticated than the last. The display showed comparative images from different conquered worlds. Verdania's original, crude constructions looked almost primitive compared to the installations on Helix Prime, which in turn seemed rough compared to the elegant death machines rising on Sanctuary's rest. They're learning, Thane continued, his voice steady despite the implications. Not just tactics or technology, but strategic thinking. The latest Ork installations show evidence of long-term planning that extends beyond simple warfare. They're building infrastructure for permanent occupation and systematic expansion. Inquisitor Valerius leaned forward, her augmetic eye clicking as it focused on the data streams. There's something else. The psychic emanations from conquered territories are creating a feedback loop. Each world they take makes the collective Ork consciousness stronger, which in turn makes their technology more effective. They're approaching a critical threshold where their expansion becomes self-sustaining. The room fell silent as the implications sank in. A self-sustaining Ork expansion would be virtually impossible to stop through conventional military means. Once they reached sufficient mass, they would become a permanent galactic threat that could consume entire sectors. General Mordax broke the silence with a question everyone had been avoiding. What about exterminatus protocols? The words hung in the air like a death sentence. Exterminatus, the complete sterilization of planetary surfaces through orbital bombardment, virus bombing, or worse. It was the Imperium's ultimate weapon, reserved for threats that exceeded all other response capabilities. 23 worlds, Admiral Korath said quietly. Hundreds of billions of Imperial citizens. The economic disruption alone would cripple 3 adjacent sectors. Dead citizens can't work for the enemy, Mordax replied grimly. And if we don't stop this expansion now, we'll be facing the choice between 23 worlds or 200. Inquisitor Valerius accessed classified files through her neural interface, her expression growing more grave as she reviewed data that carried the highest security classifications. The Ordo Xenos has contingency protocols for this scenario. Operation Burning Sky. Coordinated exterminatus strikes on all compromised worlds, followed by systematic purging of surrounding systems to prevent spore contamination. The strategic logic was undeniable. Ork spores could lie dormant for decades, waiting for the right conditions to spawn new populations. Even successful planetary reconquest would leave worlds vulnerable to future outbreaks. Only complete sterilization could guarantee the threat was eliminated, but the human cost would be staggering. There are still survivors on some of those worlds, Captain Thane said, thinking of the desperate resistance fighters who continued transmitting intelligence despite impossible odds. PDF remnants, civilian populations in hiding, entire cities that might still be holding out in remote regions. Acceptable losses, Valerius replied with the cold calculation of someone who had made similar decisions before. The needs of the many outweigh the needs of the few. Better to sacrifice millions to save billions. Admiral Korath studied the faces around the table. Dedicated Imperial servants wrestling with a decision that would define their souls for whatever time they had remaining. Each of them had sworn oaths to protect Imperial citizens. Now they were contemplating the systematic murder of those same citizens to prevent a greater catastrophe. "How long do we have?" Korath asked. "Our xenobiological specialists estimate 6 to 8 weeks before the Ork expansion reaches critical mass," Valerius answered. "After that point, conventional military responses become ineffective. The decision window is closing rapidly." The Admiral activated his personal Vox recorder, knowing that his next words would be scrutinized by historians and inquisitors for centuries to come. "I am invoking Emergency Protocol Omega-7. All available Imperial forces will prepare for Operation Burning Sky. Exterminatus fleets will be positioned at optimal firing coordinates. Evacuation assets will attempt rescue operations on worlds showing minimal Ork contamination." He paused, the weight of condemned worlds pressing down on his shoulders. "However, I am also authorizing one final attempt at conventional intervention. If the Adeptus Astartes can achieve decisive victory on a key world, it might disrupt their expansion pattern enough to make exterminatus unnecessary." It was a desperate gamble built on hope rather than strategy. But in the grim darkness of the far future, sometimes hope was the only weapon that remained. "The Emperor protects," Valerius intoned, though her voice carried more resignation than faith. "The Emperor protects." The room echoed, each officer knowing they were about to test that protection against impossible odds. The Thunderhawk gunships of the Crimson Fists chapter descended through Verdania's atmosphere like falling stars, their hull-mounted weaponry painting the sky with lass fire as they engaged the crude but numerous Ork aircraft that rose to meet them. Brother Captain Aldrich Cantor watched the planet's transformed surface through the armored viewports, his superhuman vision cataloging targets with the methodical precision of 2 centuries combat experience. Where once golden wheat fields had waved in gentle breezes, now massive Ork installations sprawled across continents like metallic tumors. The great rock launcher dominated the horizon, a twisted spire of metal and fury that pierced the upper atmosphere, surrounded by defensive positions that bristled with enough firepower to level cities. "Brothers," Cantor spoke through the Vox network, his voice carrying the absolute authority of the Adeptus Astartes. "Today we face an enemy that has learned to think beyond mere violence. They have become strategists, builders, visionaries of destruction. We must remind them that strategy means nothing against the fury of the Emperor's angels." The Crimson Fist's strike force consisted of 3 full companies, 90 Space Marines supported by Thunderhawk gunships, Predator tanks, and enough ammunition to wage war for months. It was a force capable of conquering most worlds single-handedly. Against the Ork Empire that Verdania had become, it represented barely a pinprick. But pinpricks, applied with precision to vital organs, could still be fatal. The primary landing zone was the ruins of Golden Fields, where Ork fortifications had been built atop the graves of 4 billion Imperial citizens. Cantor's tactical display showed enemy positions in overwhelming detail, defensive lines that extended for kilometers, artillery emplacements that could engage targets in low orbit, and massive troop concentrations that dwarfed anything in the Imperial Guard's organizational charts. "Drop pod assault commencing," reported Sergeant Castillo, his voice tight with anticipation. "Target: the primary command complex. Emperor willing, we'll take their leadership before they know we're here. The drop pods screamed down through Verdania's poisoned atmosphere, their heat shields glowing white-hot as they punched through layers of toxic clouds that rose from Ork industrial installations. Each pod contained 5 Space Marines and enough firepower to level city blocks. They never reached the ground. The Ork Air Defense Network opened fire with a coordination that would have impressed Imperial tacticians. Crude but effective missiles rose to meet the falling pods, guided by targeting systems that shouldn't have worked but functioned with devastating accuracy. Of 12 drop pods launched, only 4 reached their intended landing zones intact. Brother Sergeant Vask was in the 5th pod when it took a direct hit 3,000 meters above the surface. The explosion split the pod's armored hull like an overripe fruit, sending Space Marines tumbling through toxic air toward a surface covered in scrap metal and crude spikes. His last transmission was a battle cry that echoed across the Vox network. For Dawn and the Emperor. Cantor's own drop pod crashed into what had once been the planetary governor's garden, its impact crater crushing Ork defensive positions and sending alien bodies flying like broken toys. But as he and his brothers emerged from the smoking wreckage, they found themselves surrounded by enemy forces that displayed tactical awareness far beyond traditional Ork capabilities. "Covering fire, left flank!" Cantor shouted as his bolt pistol punched explosive rounds through Ork torsos. "Brother Martinez, suppress that heavy weapon position." The battle that followed violated every principle of Ork warfare that Imperial tactical manuals described. Instead of charging forward in mindless fury, the Orks used disciplined fire and movement tactics. They coordinated their attacks through sophisticated communication networks. Most disturbingly, they adapted their strategies in real time based on Space Marine responses. Brother Captain Torres found himself pinned down behind the wreckage of an Ork vehicle that had been deliberately positioned to create a killing field. Through his helm's auto-sensors, he could hear Ork commanders issuing orders in heavily accented but tactically sound low Gothic. "Bring up the heavy shooters. Flank 'em from the left. Keep 'em pinned while we get the big guns in position." It was like fighting against a mirror image of Imperial Guard tactics, implemented with Ork brutality and enhanced by their natural resistance to injury and death. The turning point came when Cantor's force reached the primary objective, the command complex that had been built from the bones of Verdania's Cathedral of the Golden Throne. Here, in chambers where billions of faithful had once worshipped the god Emperor, Ork warlords directed their global conquest from thrones made of human skulls. Big Mech Scarjaw was waiting for them. "Space Marines!" the massive Ork roared, his cybernetic enhancements gleaming in the light of burning promethium. "We was wondering when you boys would show up. Been saving the best fights for ya." The duel between Cantor and Scarjaw would have been the stuff of legends under different circumstances. Two masters of warfare, human and alien, meeting in single combat while their forces clashed around them. But this wasn't a story of heroic glory. It was a demonstration of how much the enemy had learned from studying captured Imperial personnel. Scarjaw fought with weapons and tactics that showed clear influence from Space Marine combat doctrines. His crude power claw incorporated design elements obviously reverse-engineered from captured Imperial equipment. His combat style showed evidence of studying Astartes' training methods, adapted to suit Ork physiology and enhanced by their natural aggression. "You boys fight good," Scarjaw admitted as his power claw locked against Cantor's chainsword, alien strength matching superhuman skill. But we fight better. We learned from the best, learned from you. The battle raged for 17 minutes before Cantor's superior training and equipment finally prevailed. Scarjaw's head rolled across the chamber floor, his cybernetic eye still glowing as life faded from his crude features. But even as the Crimson Fists claimed victory in the command complex, reports flooded in from across the planet. The Ork forces weren't collapsing with their leader's death. They were continuing operations according to established protocols. Scarjaw had been just one warlord among many, and his death barely disrupted the broader war machine. Cantor stood among the ruins of what had once been humanity's most sacred space on Verdania, listening to casualty reports that painted a grim picture. 43 Space Marines dead or critically wounded. Enemy forces barely diminished. The great rock launcher still operational and preparing to fire again. "Sir," Brother Martinez reported through blood-foamed lips, "the enemy is regrouping. They're using our own tactical manuals against us. It's like fighting ourselves, but stronger and more numerous." Through the shattered windows of the command complex, Cantor could see the truth that every Imperial commander now faced. The Orks had evolved beyond what humanity could defeat through conventional warfare. The time for half measures was over. Admiral Korath received Brother Captain Cantor's final transmission at 1847 hours, ship time. The Space Marine's voice, transmitted through failing Vox equipment while under heavy fire, carried the weight of absolute tactical assessment delivered by someone who had accepted his own death. "Admiral, the Orks have achieved strategic parity with Imperial doctrine. Conventional military solutions are no longer viable. Recommend immediate implementation of exterminatus protocols. The Emperor's mercy is the only gift we can offer these worlds now." The transmission ended with the sound of bolter fire and alien war cries. Korath stood in the strategium of the Emperor's wrath, surrounded by the assembled commanders of Battlefleet Obscurus. Through the armored viewports, Verdania hung in space like a diseased jewel, its surface glowing with the malevolent energy of Ork industry. Around it, 17 other worlds burned with similar corruption, their transformed ecosystems pumping out spores and war materiel with terrifying efficiency. "Gentlemen," Korath began, his words carrying the finality of a funeral oration, "we have reached the point where mercy becomes cruelty and salvation requires damnation. The Xeno's corruption has exceeded all containment protocols. Operation Burning Sky is now in effect." The fleet captains who surrounded him were veterans of a dozen major campaigns. They had burned heretical worlds, shattered Xeno's fleets, and faced the galaxy's worst horrors with unflinching resolve. But what they contemplated now dwarfed every previous operation in scope and moral weight. Captain Valdris of the battle barge Imperial Retribution spoke first. "Sir, our scouts report that some worlds still show signs of human resistance. Sanctuary's Rest has PDF holdouts broadcasting on emergency frequencies. Agrippa the Seventh shows signs of civilian populations in the northern continents." "Acceptable losses," replied Inquisitor Valerius, her servo skull projecting tactical data that supported her cold calculations. "Each day we delay costs us additional worlds. The contamination spreads faster than we can respond." We must cut out this cancer before it metastasizes beyond our ability to contain. The technical preparations had been completed during the 48 hours following Cantor's assessment. 18 battle barges and cruisers had taken positions at optimal firing solutions around the infected worlds. Each ship carried enough cyclonic torpedoes to crack planetary crusts, virus bombs capable of sterilizing entire continents, and atmospheric incinerators that could burn away every molecule of oxygen in a world's sky. But Verdania required special attention. The planet's transformation into a fortress world meant that conventional exterminatus weapons might not penetrate its defenses. The Great Rock Launcher had been reinforced with void shields and point defense systems that could intercept orbital bombardments. Worse, intelligence suggested that the Orks had been experimenting with captured Imperial technology, possibly including defensive systems reverse-engineered from Navy specifications. "Sir," reported Fleet Ordnance Officer Magnus Thorne, "Target Verdania requires maximum firepower concentration. Recommend coordinated strike with all available cyclonic torpedoes, followed by sustained bombardment until planetary cohesion is achieved." Planetary cohesion. The clinical term for breaking a world into pieces small enough that nothing could ever live there again. Captain Thane of the frigate Righteous Dawn had volunteered for the final reconnaissance mission, knowing that someone needed to witness what they were about to destroy. His ship's auger arrays provided detailed scans of the target worlds in their final hours, recording data that would be studied by Imperial strategists for centuries to come. "Sir, confirmed human life signs on all target worlds," Thane reported, his voice steady despite the magnitude of what his sensors revealed. "Verdania shows approximately 50,000 survivors in scattered locations. Helix Prime has larger populations in the southern hemisphere, possibly as many as 200,000. The total across all target worlds." He paused, consulting his calculations. "Approximately 4 million Imperial citizens still alive. 4 million people who would die in the next hour to prevent 4 billion from dying in the next year." The mathematics of survival had always been brutal in the 41st millennium, but rarely so starkly defined. Every Imperial commander present had sworn oaths to protect human life. Now they prepared to take it on a scale that would have horrified the ancients who first took those same oaths. "Final transmission to all surviving Imperial personnel on target worlds," Korath commanded. "Authorization Omega Black, full encryption." The message was brief, transmitted on emergency frequencies that desperate survivors would be monitoring. "To all Imperial forces and citizens on designated worlds, your sacrifice preserves the Imperium. Your courage honors the throne. The Emperor protects even in death. May you find peace in his light." There would be no evacuation attempts, no last-minute rescues, no mercy for the living to spare suffering for the dying. The contamination was too complete, the risk too great, the timeline too compressed. Brother Captain Cantor, if he still lived, would die knowing that his sacrifice had meaning. The PDF holdouts would perish fighting for a cause greater than their own survival. The civilians hiding in basement shelters would meet the Emperor, never knowing why their world had to burn. "Fleet positions confirmed," reported Fleet Navigation Officer Castellan. "All ships report ready for coordinated strike." Korath took one final look at the tactical displays showing worlds that had once fed the Imperium, where children had played and lovers had walked beneath alien suns. In moments, those worlds would be nothing but expanding clouds of superheated debris. "In the name of the God Emperor of mankind," he said, his words carried to every ship in the fleet, "and for the preservation of humanity throughout the galaxy, commence exterminatus." The weapons fired simultaneously across 18 star systems, carrying death to worlds that had known only peace until the green tide found them. Still with us as the darkness deepens? The tension builds beyond breaking. Subscribe to witness how even the most terrible choices carry consequences that echo across the void. The first cyclonic torpedo struck Verdania's northern hemisphere at 1851 hours ship time. The impact site, what had once been the agricultural center of new prosperity, vanished in a sphere of nuclear fire that expanded at near light speed, vaporizing everything within a 1,000-kilometer radius. The planet's crust cracked like an eggshell, releasing geothermal forces that had been contained for millions of years. Admiral Korath watched through the Emperor's Wrath's primary view screen as 18 worlds died simultaneously across the tactical display. Each death was different. Some planets cracked along tectonic lines. Others simply boiled away their atmospheres. A few shattered completely into asteroid fields that would orbit their suns as monuments to this moment. But the Orks didn't die quietly. "Sir!" shouted Lieutenant Karras, his augmetic sensors overloading from the energy readings. "Multiple launches from target worlds. They're firing rocks even as their planets break apart." The Great Rock Launcher on Verdania had continued operating until the moment the cyclonic torpedoes reached it. In those final seconds, as the planet's surface began liquefying, Ork mechs had somehow managed to fire 3 more ship-sized projectiles toward distant star systems. Similar launches came from other doomed worlds, desperate shots fired by aliens who treated death as just another opportunity for violence. "Tracking the trajectories," reported Fleet Navigation Officer Castellan, his voice tight with concern. "The projectiles are heading for Tertius Prime, Agathon's world, and Emperor preserve us. Macreg approaches." Macreg, the home world of the Ultramarines, one of the Imperium's most heavily defended fortress worlds. If Ork Roks somehow managed to reach that system, they would face defenses that could vaporize small fleets. But the very fact that dying Orks had aimed their final shots at such a prestigious target revealed how much they had learned about Imperial politics and psychology. The destruction continued with mechanical precision. Helix Prime's agricultural domes collapsed as atmospheric pressure dropped to vacuum levels. Sanctuary's rest burned like a torch as its oxygen-rich atmosphere ignited in a planet-wide firestorm. Agrippa VII simply cracked in half, its molten core spraying into space in geysers of superheated rock. But the most disturbing reports came from the fleet's astropaths. As each world died, the psychic emanations that had powered the Ork war machine didn't simply vanish. They transformed. The collective death scream of billions of life forms created psychic shockwaves that rippled through the warp, carrying with them the last thoughts and emotions of everything that had lived on those worlds. "Admiral," reported Chief Astropath Valdine, blood seeping from her eyes as she struggled to process the psychic catastrophe. "The warp currents are screaming. The death of so many worlds simultaneously has created a psychic storm unlike anything in our records. Navigation will be impossible for months, possibly years." The implications staggered even veteran fleet commanders. By destroying 18 worlds simultaneously, They had inadvertently created a warp storm that would isolate this entire sector from the rest of the Imperium. No reinforcements could arrive. No supplies could be shipped. No communications could reach Terra to report what had happened here. They had stopped the Ork expansion, but at the cost of cutting themselves off from the galaxy. Captain Thane, monitoring the destruction from the righteous dawn, began receiving the final transmissions from dying worlds. Most were simple distress calls or prayers to the Emperor, but some carried intelligence that would haunt Imperial strategists for generations. "This is Colonel Helena Vask, PDF Command, Agrippa 7, came one transmission, barely audible through static and the sound of cracking stone. Final report. The Orks knew. Somehow, they knew this was coming. They've been preparing. The rocks they launched. They're not random. They're targeting worlds based on strategic importance. This isn't the end of their expansion. It's the beginning of the next phase." The transmission ended as Agrippa VII's northern continent cracked away from its moorings and tumbled into space. Similar reports came from other worlds. Ork commanders issuing final orders to surviving forces. Mechs activating delayed release spore pods that would drift through space for decades before finding new worlds to infect. Even in death, the aliens were planning for future wars. Brother Captain Cantor's final transmission reached the fleet, just as Verdania's death entered its final phase. His voice, transmitted from deep within the planet's crust where he and his surviving battle brothers had taken shelter, carried the exhausted resignation of someone who had fought beyond the limits of human endurance. "This is Cantor. The Xenos have adapted beyond our ability to predict or counter. They learned not just our tactics, but our psychology. They understand how we think, how we plan, how we respond to threats. Exterminatus was the correct decision, but it won't end their expansion. They're too smart now, too adaptive. The next worlds they take will be harder to root out, better defended, more strategically positioned. We've bought time, not victory." The transmission dissolved into static as Verdania's core finally collapsed, taking the last of the Crimson Fists with it. Admiral Korath stood in silence as the tactical displays showed 18 empty star systems where thriving worlds had existed hours before. The immediate threat had been eliminated, but at costs that would ripple across the sector for generations. Quadrillions of tons of food production lost, trillions of Imperial citizens dead, strategic resources eliminated, industrial capacity destroyed. And in the deep void between stars, 43 Ork rocks continued their journeys toward worlds that didn't yet know their peaceful days were numbered. "Sir," whispered Captain Valdris, "what do we tell Terra when communications are restored?" Korath looked at the expanding debris fields that marked the graves of worlds, knowing that history would judge every decision made in this chamber. "We tell them the truth. We stop this. Wah. But the next one will be smarter, better prepared, and more dangerous than anything the Imperium has faced before." The green tide had been halted, but at the cost of teaching the survivors exactly how far humanity would go to stop them. 2 years after the Verdania incident, as Imperial historians would later call it, the first reports reached Terra through the slowly healing warp storms. The documents, sealed with the highest security classifications and marked with the skull and crossed swords of the Inquisition, told a story that would reshape humanity's understanding of the Ork threat for millennia to come. In the halls of the Imperial Palace, where the God Emperor of mankind held his eternal vigil upon the Golden Throne, the High Lords of Terra convened in emergency session. The data crystals before them contained picked captures, tactical analyses, and survivor testimonies that painted a picture of Xenos evolution unlike anything in the Imperium's vast archives. "The Orks are learning," stated Lord Commander Militant Hass, his augmetic voice echoing through the sealed chamber. "Not just adapting to immediate threats, but engaging in long-term strategic planning. They're becoming something we've never faced before, a truly intelligent enemy." The evidence was undeniable. Across the galaxy, scattered reports from sectors that had experienced similar Ork incursions showed disturbing patterns. The aliens were no longer content with random raiding and mindless destruction. They studied captured Imperial personnel, reverse-engineered technology with frightening efficiency, and most disturbing of all, planned campaigns that spanned decades rather than months. On the world of Tychus Prime, 3 sectors distant from the Verdania system, an Ork invasion had begun with textbook Imperial Guard tactics. The aliens deployed combined arms formations, used coordinated artillery barrages, and even attempted diplomatic contact before commencing hostilities. When the PDF responded with standard anti-Ork tactics, they found themselves fighting an enemy that anticipated every move and countered with strategies lifted directly from Imperial tactical manuals. The learning wasn't limited to military doctrine. Captured facilities showed evidence of Ork attempts to understand human psychology, economics, and social structures. They were studying their prey with the methodical thoroughness of natural scientists, seeking weaknesses that could be exploited in future campaigns. But perhaps most terrifying were the reports from the few survivors who had escaped Ork-controlled territories. They spoke of aliens who could speak fluent High Gothic, who understood Imperial chain of command structures, and who showed genuine curiosity about human culture beyond its potential for entertainment or exploitation. Sister Superior Katerina Vex, one of only 17 survivors evacuated from the Helix system before its destruction, provided testimony that chilled even seasoned inquisitors. They asked questions, not for torture or interrogation, but because they wanted to understand. They wanted to know why humans fought so hard for worlds they would eventually lose. Why we worshipped the Emperor. Why we feared chaos more than death. It was as if they were trying to understand what made us human. The implications extended far beyond military considerations. If Orks could truly comprehend human motivations, they could predict Imperial responses with unprecedented accuracy. They could manipulate human psychology, exploit cultural weaknesses, and wage war not just against human bodies, but against human souls. Admiral Korath, promoted to Sector Fleet Command in recognition of his decisive action during the crisis, submitted his final report from the fortress world of Cypra Mundi. His analysis, marked with personal seals and written in his own hand, concluded with words that would haunt Imperial strategic doctrine for centuries. "We have created our own worst enemy. By forcing the Orks to adapt or die, we have accelerated their evolution beyond what natural selection might have achieved in millennia. Each world we cleanse through exterminatus teaches the survivors to be more careful, more thorough, more human in their approach to conquest. We are fighting a war against students who learn from every lesson we teach them." The scattered Ork rocks launched from dying worlds had found their targets with disturbing accuracy. Tertius Prime fell to an invasion force that landed with detailed knowledge of planetary defenses, population centers, and resource locations. The Orks didn't waste time on random destruction. They struck with surgical precision at targets that would maximize psychological impact while minimizing their own casualties. Agathon's world endured a siege that lasted 14 months, conducted by Ork forces that demonstrated patience, logistics planning, and strategic deception capabilities that rivaled the finest Imperial Guard regiments. When the world finally fell, it was because the Ork commander had successfully predicted and countered every relief attempt, turning human tactical doctrine against itself. Most disturbing was the fate of the rock aimed at Macreg approaches. It never reached the Ultramarines' home system. Instead, it performed a calculated course correction that brought it to the agricultural world of Thessian Minor. The aliens aboard that rock had somehow recognized that striking at Macreg directly would result in their destruction, while targeting a less defended but strategically important world would achieve greater long-term benefits. They had learned restraint, they had learned strategy, they had learned to think like humans. In the deepest vaults beneath the Imperial Palace, where forbidden knowledge was stored under the personal seal of the Emperor himself, new protocols were drafted for dealing with what scholars termed adaptive Xenos threats. The documents, classified beyond even inquisitorial access levels, outlined contingency plans for enemies that could evolve faster than Imperial doctrine could adapt. The green tide had been stopped at Verdania, but only by teaching the survivors exactly how much humanity was willing to sacrifice to achieve victory. Somewhere in the void between stars, new wars were forming, led by Orks who understood human psychology, who planned with human intelligence, and who fought with alien strength enhanced by human knowledge. The galaxy had become a more dangerous place, and humanity had only itself to blame. Yet in the grim darkness of the far future, where there was only war, even the worst defeats carried lessons that might someday lead to victory. The Imperium endured not because it was perfect, but because it learned from its mistakes, even when those mistakes cost entire worlds. The Emperor's light burned eternal, but it cast shadows that grew darker with each passing year. In the end, Verdania's fall taught the Imperium a lesson written in the ashes of 18 worlds and paid for with the lives of billions. That survival sometimes demands becoming the very monster you fight against. The green tide that swept across those peaceful agricultural worlds didn't just consume human lives. It consumed human innocence, forcing the Imperium to confront the brutal mathematics of extinction. The survivors who escaped the cleansing fires carried more than trauma. They carried knowledge. Every refugee settlement, every debriefing session, every whispered story in refugee camps spread the same terrible understanding. The Orks were no longer the mindless savages of Imperial propaganda. They had become something far more dangerous. Students of human warfare who learned faster than their teachers could adapt. In the decades that followed, Imperial tactical doctrine underwent revolutionary changes. The Codex Astartes received its first major revision in 4 millennia, incorporating new strategies for fighting adaptive enemies. The Imperial Guard developed protocols for rapid tactical shifts designed to prevent enemy learning. Even the Inquisition established new ordos dedicated to studying and countering intelligent Xenos threats. But perhaps the greatest change was in the human spirit itself. The citizens of 1,000 worlds looked up at their skies with new understanding, knowing that peace was not the absence of war, but merely the calm between storms. Children born after the Verdania incident grew up hearing bedtime stories not of heroic victories, but of the terrible price of survival in a galaxy that had no mercy for the weak or naive. The agricultural worlds that replaced the lost systems were built as fortress farms, their golden wheat fields dotted with defense turrets and orbital monitoring stations. Paradise could still exist in the 41st millennium, but only behind walls of adamantium and vigilance. Beauty endured, but at the cost of innocence. Deep in the void between stars, Ork spores drifted on solar winds and waited in the ruins of dead asteroids, patient as cancer cells in a healthy body. Some would find new worlds to corrupt, beginning the cycle anew. Others would drift for centuries before awakening to find themselves in an Imperium that had learned to be as ruthless as its enemies. The green tide had been stopped, but at the cost of teaching the galaxy's most persistent plague exactly how far humanity would go to survive. In saving billions, the Imperium had created an enemy that understood not just human tactics, but human souls. The next war would be led by orcs who knew that humans fought hardest when they had something to protect, and who would therefore ensure that humans had nothing left to protect. Admiral Korath, in his final years, would often stand at the observation decks of Imperial vessels and stare out at the stars, wondering which distant lights shone on worlds where former refugees told their children about the price of peace. He had saved the sector, but at the cost of its innocence. He had stopped the green tide, but by teaching it to be smarter, more patient, more human in its approach to conquest. In the end, the Verdania incident became more than a military campaign. It became a mirror that reflected humanity's true face back at itself. When pressed to the ultimate choice between mercy and survival, the Imperium had chosen survival. When forced to choose between the few and the many, it had chosen the many. When confronted with an enemy that could learn, it had become a teacher of the most terrible lessons imaginable. The Emperor's light still burned eternal across 1,000,000 worlds, but it cast longer shadows than before. In those shadows, orcs with human intelligence planned wars with alien patience, creating a future where every imperial victory would come at an ever-increasing cost. The green tide would return, smarter, stronger, and more dangerous than before. But when it did, it would find an Imperium that had learned its own lessons about the price of survival in a galaxy where there was only war. The Emperor protects those who are willing to do whatever it takes to be protected, even if it damns their souls in the process. The Emperor protects. More stories await.